My name is Julian. I am 32 years old. 4 years ago, the absolute cruelty of my own flesh and blood changed my life forever. While I was standing in my cheap, rented cap and gown, waiting to receive a college degree I had practically starved and bled for, my mother called to tell me they were not coming. She spoke in that icy, perfectly polished tone of hers and called my graduation a failure ceremony. They completely abandoned me on the most important day of my life, laughing and drinking expensive champagne at a lavish garden party back in Boston with my younger brother, Preston. But there is one thing they did not know. They did not know about the heavy cedar box my late grandmother left me, the secret photographs hidden inside, or the multimillion-dollar data analytics company I was building in the shadows. And now, the same people who threw me away like garbage are begging for my money and my mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little empire piece by piece, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And do not forget to tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let us go back to where it all began. I still remember the exact weather on my graduation day. It was one of those crisp, unusually warm May afternoons in New England, where the sky is a blinding, uninterrupted blue. The university campus was swarming with proud parents carrying oversized flower bouquets and balloons that tangled in the breeze. I stood near the edge of the quad, completely alone, watching the world celebrate around me. I watched fathers adjusting their kids' ties, pulling them into rough, proud hugs, their voices cracking as they told their sons how proud they were. I saw mothers snapping hundreds of photos, fixing their daughter's hair, wiping away tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Everywhere I looked, I saw families, real families, the kind of families that actually show up for each other, the kind that celebrate milestones instead of treating them like massive, unbearable inconveniences. I was graduating at the very top of my class with a degree in data science and healthcare systems. I did not have a single dime from a family college fund, not one red cent. While my peers were spending their weekends going to frat parties, taking spontaneous trips down to Florida for spring break, or living off the massive allowances their parents wired them every Friday, I was working terrible, soul-crushing night shifts. I spent 4 years scrubbing the sticky, cracked vinyl floors of a 24-hour diner situated right off the interstate. It was the kind of place where truck drivers and exhausted travelers would leave crumpled dollar bills as tips, completely oblivious to the fact that I was mentally calculating my advanced statistics homework while wiping spilled ketchup off their tables. I would walk back to my freezing dorm room at 2 in the morning, my cheap uniform reeking of stale coffee, maple syrup, and fryer grease. Every single paycheck went straight to textbooks and the bare minimum of groceries. I applied for every single academic grant in the state of Massachusetts. I took on student loans with interest rates that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, calculating how many decades it would take to pay them off. I earned that degree with zero family money, zero family support, and absolutely zero family pride. I had mailed my parents the heavy, expensive, embossed invitation months in advance. I paid extra for the nice envelopes, hoping the visual weight of the achievement might finally earn me a sliver of their respect. I followed up with text messages that went completely unanswered. I even lowered my expectations enough to hope for the absolute bare minimum. I thought maybe, just maybe, my father Richard would drive up from Boston. I pictured him standing quietly in the back of the auditorium, wearing one of his expensive custom suits, giving me a polite nod of acknowledgement when the dean called my name. I thought my mother Victoria might at least send a generic Hallmark greeting card with a check inside, just to keep up appearances for the postman. What I got instead was a phone call exactly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I was standing in front of a cracked mirror in the communal campus bathroom, trying to figure out how to pin the cheap graduation tassel to my cap. My phone buzzed on the wet porcelain counter. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I answered the phone with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I actually, foolishly, thought she was calling to say they were looking for parking or asking which entrance to use. My mother's voice on the other end of the line was completely steady. There was no background noise of a highway. There was no apology in her tone. There was no hesitation whatsoever. She did not even bother to say hello or ask how I was feeling. She just launched right into the execution. "Julian," she said, her voice dripping with an exhausting kind of boredom. "We are not going to make it today. Honestly, I do not believe in celebrating mediocrity disguised as ambition. A state school degree in computers is nothing to make a fuss over. It is a working-class failure ceremony, Julian, and I simply will not have our neighbors thinking this is the standard we set for this family." I stood there, staring at my own pale reflection in the mirror, completely paralyzed. Before my brain could even formulate a single word to defend myself, before I could scream or beg or ask why she hated me so much, the line went dead. She hung up on me. I crossed that stage anyway. I walked up the wooden steps, shook the dean's hand, and grabbed my diploma cover with a grip so tight my knuckles turned completely white under the stage lights. When I looked out into the massive sea of folding chairs, scanning the thousands of cheering faces, there was only one person standing for me. My grandmother Beatrice. She was standing in the back aisle, leaning heavily on her wooden cane, clapping so hard her fragile, arthritis-riddled hands were probably bruised. She had taken a brutal 5-hour bus ride from the coast of Maine just to be there. But the block of 4 premium seats I had reserved specifically for my parents and my brother remained entirely, agonizingly empty. Later that afternoon, while I was sitting alone in my cramped, unair-conditioned apartment, eating a cold turkey sandwich and staring at my framed diploma leaning against the wall, I made the terrible mistake of opening social media. My mother had just posted an entire album of high-resolution photographs. They were not busy working. There was no sudden family emergency. There was no traffic jam. They were hosting a sprawling, catered luncheon at our family's massive real estate property in Boston. I stared at the screen, my eyes burning with a mixture of grief and pure rage. I zoomed in on the crystal glasses catching the afternoon sunlight. I looked at the imported summer roses decorating the tables. I looked at the perfectly ironed linen napkins and the flawlessly dressed guests from the country club. And right in the center of every single photograph was my younger brother, Preston, the golden child. He was holding a glass of champagne, wearing a designer suit, smiling that perfect, expensive orthodontist-crafted smile of his. My mother completely ignored my graduation like it was a dirty secret, a stain on her perfect public record, choosing instead to curate a flawless afternoon for her wealthy friends. I took out my phone and I saved every single one of those screenshots. I backed them up to a cloud drive. Some primal survival instinct inside me knew that one day I would need undeniable proof that the cruelty had been real. I told myself that day, sitting on my lumpy mattress, that this would be the very last time I ever expected a single drop of love from Victoria and Richard. I moved on with my life. I worked relentlessly. I took every ounce of that brutal rejection, every ounce of that public humiliation, and turned it into high-octane fuel. Over the next 4 years, I channeled all my anger, all my grief, and all my isolation into my work. I stopped caring about holidays. I stopped caring about weekends. I built a massive, incredibly complex analytics platform designed specifically to flag suspicious hospital billing patterns and massive insurance fraud. I started out in a tiny rented office above a dry cleaner, with bad heating and flickering fluorescent lights. I was working 18-hour days, sleeping under my desk on a cheap yoga mat, eating ramen noodles while writing code until my vision blurred. But the software worked. It grew faster than I could have ever predicted. Massive healthcare networks started knocking on my door. Compliance firms wanted exclusive, multi-year licenses. Then, a major tech firm came in with an acquisition offer. When my corporate lawyer sent me the term sheet, the numbers on my screen literally looked like a typographical error. It was generational wealth. I negotiated the final details of the deal myself. I signed the papers. I secured a buyout that absolutely eclipsed everything my parents had built over their entire lives in the real estate market. The business media picked up the story immediately. My face was suddenly splashed across the trade press, Forbes Online, and industry newsletters. And exactly like clockwork, the vultures started circling. Families like mine do not care about you when you are struggling. They will watch you drown, they will criticize your swimming technique while you gasp for air, but they always come back when your success gives them something to brag about. My phone lit up with a Boston area code. A number I knew by heart but had not seen on my screen in 4 years. It was my mother. I answered it just to hear what she would say. Her voice was softer, sweeter, and more delicate than I had ever heard it in my entire life. She actually called me sweetheart. "Julian, sweetheart," she cooed. "The family saw the news. We missed you terribly, darling. We are so incredibly proud of our brilliant boy. We need to talk. I am organizing a special family meeting for tomorrow in Boston to celebrate your success." I sat in my high-rise corner office, looking out at the sprawling city skyline, holding the phone to my ear. I listened to the desperate, sickening greed disguised as motherly love. I did not yell. I did not curse at her. I did not ask her why she wasn't there when I got my diploma. I just replied with 5 simple words. "Too late. Way too late." Then I hung up the phone. I blocked the number. I thought the worst was over. I thought I had finally won and could walk away in peace. I was so incredibly wrong. To truly understand the sheer audacity of my mother's phone call, you have to understand exactly what kind of people my parents are. My family lived in a historic, sprawling Boston house that looked like it belonged on the glossy cover of a luxury architectural magazine. It had perfectly manicured lawns that were aggressively cut twice a week by a landscaping crew. It had a massive wrought iron gate. It was controlled by a neighborhood HOA board that would literally fine you thousands of dollars if your front porch curtains were the wrong shade of white or if your holiday decorations stayed up one day past January 1st. But emotionally, that house was entirely refrigerated on the inside. Everything was an intricate, exhausting, full-time performance. My parents cared deeply about being seen at the right country clubs. They cared about hosting the perfect Thanksgiving dinners where everyone wore cashmere sweaters and pretended to like each other over dry turkey and expensive wine. They cared about maintaining the prestige of their zip code, and they cared deeply about the right people seeing them do the right things. I simply did not fit into that performance. My younger brother Preston did. Preston had my mother's bright blonde hair, her soft, aristocratic features, and her natural ability to charm a room without saying anything of actual substance. He was born for the country club life. I, on the other hand, had my father's dark hair, his sharp jawline, and a pair of dark eyes that seemed to make my mother visibly uncomfortable simply by existing in the same room. Whenever she looked at me, her jaw would tighten. She looked at me not like a son, but like an unpaid debt she was forced to look at every single day. The contrast in how we were treated was not subtle. It was violent in its obviousness. On Preston's 16th birthday, my parents threw a massive catered party at the estate and handed him the keys to a brand new Porsche. When he went off to a private university, a school my father made a massive donation to so they would overlook Preston's abysmal GPA, they upgraded him to a bright red Ferrari because the Porsche was supposedly too old and embarrassing for a fraternity president. He had a massive college fund sitting in a high-yield account, an allowance that rivaled a corporate executive's salary, and absolutely zero expectations to ever actually work a single day in his life. I was wearing thrift store clothes that smelled like mothballs. I hauled heavy bags of cement, stocked shelves, and cut keys at a local hardware store on weekends just to buy my own school supplies and winter boots. But the real, foundational trauma did not start in my teenage years when I was old enough to process the unfairness. It started when I was just 7 years old. They literally exiled me. There was no screaming fight. There was no dramatic family meeting where a therapist sat down and explained things to a confused, terrified child. I just woke up one cold November morning to find my suitcases packed with terrifying precision. They were sitting by the massive oak front door. I was put into the back of my father's luxury sedan. We drove in total silence up the highway to coastal Maine, where my grandmother Beatrice lived. My father gripped the leather steering wheel the entire time, his knuckles white, refusing to look at me in the rearview mirror. When we arrived at the small, windswept cottage, he did not try to comfort me. He did not hug me. He gave me a brief, corporate-style pat on the shoulder, cleared his throat, and told me it would be better for everyone if I stayed with Grandma for a while. A while turned into my entire childhood. My grandmother Beatrice never poisoned my mind against them. She did not have to. She simply loved me so fiercely and completely that the stark contrast between real affection and polite neglect became impossible to miss. Beatrice sat in the hard plastic folding chairs through every single terrible middle school band concert I ever had, cheering louder than anyone else. She packed my lunches every morning, always leaving a little handwritten note inside telling me how smart I was. She taught me how to read financial statements at the kitchen table when I was 12. She explained how a 401k worked, how compound interest functioned, and how the world revolved around leverage and independence. She told me over and over again that a man's true worth is built by his own two hands, his integrity, and his resilience, not by his inheritance or his fancy last name. 3 weeks before my mother made that sugary phone call about a family reunion, the only steady foundation in my entire life crumbled to dust. My grandmother passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 82. Losing her broke something fundamental inside my chest. She was the only person on this earth who had ever looked at me and seen a human being with value instead of a burden. I handled all the funeral arrangements myself. I picked out the casket. I paid for the plot. I arranged for the flowers. My parents and Preston drove up for the service. They showed up for exactly 45 minutes. They shook a few hands, stood in the back of the church, and whispered to each other. I actually heard my mother complain to Aunt Clara about how the coastal wind was ruining her blowout and how the mud in the cemetery was destroying her designer shoes. They left before the reception even started, claiming my father had a pressing real estate meeting. I stayed behind in Maine for 2 weeks to pack up her house. I could not stand the thought of strangers or cold, calculating estate liquidators coming in and touching the rooms that had kept me safe for so many years. I spent days going through her things. I boxed up her old books. I carefully folded her cardigans. I tried to hold onto the smell of vanilla, sea salt, and old paper that always clung to her. I was up in her dusty attic, sorting through old winter blankets and moth-eaten coats, when I found it. Hidden at the very bottom of a heavy, brass-lined cedar chest was a thick manila envelope. It had my name written on it in Grandma's careful, looping handwriting. I sat down on the dusty floorboards, my hands shaking slightly, and tore the flap open. The first thing I pulled out was an old, slightly faded photograph. It was my mother in her early 20s, long before the Boston high society polished all her rough edges and bought her a new nose. She was standing far too close to a man I had never seen before. He was tall, artistic-looking, wearing a worn leather jacket. His arm was wrapped tightly around her waist, and she was looking up at him with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. A look I had never seen her give my father. He was definitely not Richard. But what made the breath catch in my throat, what made my blood run absolutely cold, was his face. He had Preston's exact nose. He had Preston's exact smile. The bone structure, the jawline, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. It was terrifyingly identical. It was like looking at a ghost of my brother. The second item in the envelope was a typed note from my grandmother. I read it under the dim yellow light of the attic bulb. It read, "Julian, do not ever trust sudden kindness from family members who have spent decades proving you mean nothing to them. I have seen the rot in that house. I have seen the lies they tell to protect their public image. Protect yourself. Do not let them take what you build. The truth always leaves a paper trail." The final item was a crisp, heavy business card for a private investigator named Silas Thorne. He was based out of Portland. On the back of the card, Grandma had written one sentence in blue ink. "If they come back, start here." A cold chill ran straight down my spine. Beatrice was not a paranoid woman. She was a pragmatic, sharp-minded woman who did not believe in conspiracy theories or family drama. If she went out of her way to hire a private investigator, secure a damning photograph, and hide the findings in a cedar chest for me to find after her death, she knew a massive storm was coming. She knew the second I became successful, the second I had actual liquid money they could touch, they would try to sink their claws into me. And she was absolutely right. Exactly 48 hours after the business article about my company's multimillion-dollar acquisition hit the internet, my mother made that phone call. I looked at the photograph of the strange man again. I looked at the business card, I knew exactly what they were going to try to do. They were coming for my hard-earned money to fund their fake reality. But they had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of them. Even though I told my mother it was too late and blocked her number, the harassment did not stop. It merely shifted tactics. My father started texting me from his secure business phone. His messages were short, formal, and deeply insulting. He said they wanted to discuss honoring my grandmother's legacy. He knew exactly which emotional button to push. They were using the memory of the only woman who ever truly loved me as bait to get me in a room. I knew it was about money. It is always about money with people like them. I just did not realize how disgustingly dirty the rest of it was going to be. I decided to drive down to Boston. I didn't go for closure. I didn't go to reconcile or play the prodigal son. I went because I needed to see the exact shape of the trap they were setting before I sprang it right back in their faces. I packed my leather briefcase, put Silas Thorne's business card in my wallet, and started the engine. The drive back to Boston felt like driving across the border into a hostile foreign country. My stomach was tied in knots, but my mind was completely, terrifyingly clear. I pulled up to the massive family property. It looked even more immaculate than I remembered. They had put in fresh, expensive landscaping, new imported stone work along the sweeping driveway, and the massive front doors had a fresh coat of high-gloss paint. It was a house that whispered financial stability and old money to the outside world, even when it was built entirely on a foundation of lies, secrets, and unpaid debts. I walked around to the back terrace. A lavish lunch was laid out on the patio like we were having a civilized reunion instead of a hostage negotiation. My mother greeted me with a warm, tight hug that physically made my skin crawl. She smelled like expensive perfume and pure desperation. My father shook my hand with a firm grip, treating me exactly like a high-value client he was trying to secure for his commercial real estate firm. Preston stood there in a brand-new cashmere sweater, sipping a cocktail, giving me the awkward nod of a guy who knew he had always benefited from my exclusion, but never had the spine to admit it out loud. Also present was my Aunt Clara. Clara was the family's emotional enforcer. Whenever someone needed to be guilt-tripped into opening their wallet, signing a bad contract, or sweeping a messy divorce or scandal under the rug, Clara was deployed to talk about family duty and bloodlines. She was wearing too much jewelry and a fake, sympathetic smile. We made agonizing small talk over roasted asparagus and imported sparkling water. I watched them perform. I watched my mother pretend to care about the weather in Maine. I watched my father pretend to be interested in the tech industry. Then the expensive porcelain plates were cleared. My father cleared his throat, adjusted his heavy gold Rolex, opened a thick leather folder, and slid it across the glass table. The cover featured an elegant, custom-embossed logo. It read, "The Beatrice Legacy Foundation." According to their perfectly rehearsed pitch, this charitable foundation was going to honor my late grandmother by supporting overlooked students from fractured homes. It used all the right buzzwords: opportunity, dignity, educational access, resilience. It was absolutely disgusting. They were wearing my grandmother's pure values like a cheap Halloween costume to try and manipulate my grief. I did not say a single word. I just opened the binder and flipped straight to the financial breakdown. When you build an entire career tracking fraudulent healthcare billing and massive insurance scams, you stop listening to the emotional sales pitch and start looking strictly at the math. The math never lies. Preston was listed as the executive director, commanding a massive six-figure salary despite having exactly zero experience in nonprofit management or corporate governance. My mother had a hefty consulting stipend written in for advising the board. 2 outside marketing vendors were listed at rates so absurdly high, I almost laughed out loud right there at the table. The launch budget alone for the opening gala was bloated enough to buy a private island. The oversight structure was virtually non-existent, designed specifically to keep all spending power entirely within the family. And there, on the very last page, was the punchline. They wanted a $300,000 check from me today, as a founding family contribution to get it off the ground. My mother actually reached across the table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over mine. She looked at me with shiny, theatrical eyes, playing the role of the proud matriarch perfectly. "We know how successful you have become, Julian. We saw the Forbes article. We are so incredibly proud of you. We thought this could finally bring us back together as a family. A joint venture. Doing something good for Beatrice." Aunt Clara immediately chimed in on cue, her voice dripping with fake concern. "It makes perfect sense, Julian. It helps with your tax burden. And honestly, after everything your parents have done to maintain the family standing over the years, it is the absolute least you could do to contribute. Family helps family." That was the exact moment the final thread of my patience snapped. They did not want me back. They did not love me. They just needed a new bank to fund their lavish lifestyle. I smiled. A very calm, very dead smile. I nodded slowly. I closed the leather binder, tucked it under my arm, and looked my mother directly in the eyes. I told them I would have my corporate accountants review the proposal. I stood up, left my untouched food on the plate, and walked straight back to my car without looking back. I sent my parents a formal email the next morning demanding comprehensive financial documentation, vendor contracts, and draft bylaws for independent oversight before I released a single dime. I knew they could not provide them. When my mother realized I was not going to write a blank check blindly, the masks completely slipped off. She called me an ungrateful sociopath. My father sent me a furious text saying I was embarrassing the family name. And then the real war started. A week later, a highly damaging article popped up in a prominent industry newsletter. It did not name me outright as a criminal because wealthy people are too smart for that. Instead, it painted a picture of a brilliant but highly volatile tech founder whose sudden wealth had triggered extreme paranoia and unresolved family resentment. It implied my business judgment was deeply compromised and that I was completely unstable. Within 48 hours of that article dropping, 2 massive consulting conversations I had in the pipeline suddenly went cold. A major client asked to postpone finalizing a contract pending an internal review. The direct financial loss to my business was hovering around $2 million. My own mother was trying to destroy my livelihood simply because I refused to fund her fake charity. I was furious, but I needed to know how the newsletter got such specific, highly classified internal details about my daily operations. That is when I knew it was time to pull out the card and call Silas Thorne. I met Silas Thorne at a small, greasy diner in downtown Portland, the exact opposite of the places my parents frequented. Silas was a former forensic accountant who got bored and turned into a private investigator. He was wearing a rumpled suit, drinking black coffee, and did not waste any time with pleasantries. I slid the foundation proposal across the sticky table. He spent 20 minutes skimming the documents, looked up at me over the rim of his mug, and confirmed what my gut already knew. "Julian, if your instincts are telling you this stinks, they are being conservative," Silas said, tapping the paper with his pen. "This is a classic slush fund. The marketing agency listed here shares an address with dozens of empty shell entities." Silas dug into their finances through his back channels. The Mercer family was drowning in private debt. My father was being quietly forced out of his real estate firm due to poor performance and questionable deals, and the massive Boston house had been refinanced twice. The foundation was a life raft, and they were trying to use my money to patch the holes before they sank into public bankruptcy. But I needed Silas to figure out the leak in my own company. How did my mother know about my internal contracts? How did the newsletter get my exact schedule and the names of my prospective clients? Silas started digging into my corporate network. It took him less than 3 days to uncover the darkest betrayal of all. Maya. Maya was my operations manager. I had hired her fresh out of college when she had absolutely nothing. I mentored her, promoted her, paid her an incredible salary, and trusted her with my entire schedule and corporate strategy. Silas found a paper trail connecting a secondary bank account of Maya's to a PR consultant hired directly by my mother, Victoria. My own mother had bribed my employee. She promised Maya a future executive role at the foundation and a massive cash bonus to leak my vulnerabilities. Maya handed them the knife, and my mother drove it directly into my back. When you realize that the people who share your blood are actively trying to destroy your life, something fundamentally shifts inside your brain. Anger is an incredibly expensive emotion when your enemies are praying you become reckless. So I did the exact opposite. I became an absolute machine. I stopped returning my parents' phone calls. I cataloged every single defamatory article, every suspicious vendor contract, and every threatening text message in a secure server. I fired Maya on a rainy Tuesday morning. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I called her into my office, handed her a termination folder containing the forensic evidence of her corporate espionage, and gave her exactly 5 minutes to vacate the building under the supervision of security. The look of sheer, breathless panic on her face was deeply satisfying. She tried to cry. She tried to apologize, begging for her job back. I just pointed at the door. But Maya was only a pawn. She was just the appetizer. I needed heavy legal artillery. That is when I hired Harper Quinn. Harper was a corporate litigator known throughout the East Coast for being absolutely ruthless. She was not the kind of lawyer who sent polite cease and desist letters to negotiate a settlement. She was the kind of lawyer who burned your house down and then sued you for the cost of the matches. Harper took one look at the fraudulent foundation documents, the PR smear campaign, the shell companies, and the bribery evidence with Maya, and she shook her head. "This is no longer a family conflict, Julian," Harper said, her voice completely flat. "This is fraud, defamation, and corporate sabotage. We are going to bury them so deep they will never see sunlight again." But I needed the final piece of the puzzle. The photograph from my grandmother's cedar chest was still burning a hole in my mind. The man in the leather jacket. The man with Preston's face. Silas dug into the public archives and found him. His name was Dominic Blackwood. He was a financially unstable architectural photographer who had a very intense, very secretive affair with my mother right before she married my father. He died in a car accident over a decade ago. I needed to know why I was the son who got thrown away. I needed to know why my mother looked at me with such pure disdain. I arranged for private, legally admissible DNA testing through a lab that specialized in strict chain of custody collection. I submitted my own sample voluntarily. Getting my father's DNA was dangerously easy. During that awful lunch on the terrace in Boston, he had handed me a glass of sparkling water. When I left, I simply took the glass with me, holding it carefully by the base, and bagged it in my car. Getting Preston's sample took a bit more strategy. Before I left that house, when everyone was distracted by Aunt Clara talking about family duty, I walked into the downstairs bathroom that Preston always used. I took a hairbrush sitting on the counter that was full of his blonde hair and slipped it into a plastic bag in my pocket. We secured Dominic Blackwood's comparison sample through a sealed forensic reference held by an estate attorney that Silas managed to track down. The waiting period was absolute agony. Every single day, another piece of my professional reputation took a hit from my mother's relentless whisper campaign. She was running a full-scale reputation containment strategy against her own flesh and blood. She was laying the groundwork for a massive lawsuit, trying to paint me as the villain to anyone who would listen. Finally, the laboratory sent the sealed results. I sat alone in my kitchen, the rain beating against the windows, staring at the thick white envelope. The coffee in my mug had gone completely cold. I took a deep breath, broke the seal, and pulled out the crisp report. I read the pages 3 times because my brain refused to process the gravity of what I was seeing. I was Richard's biological son. There was absolutely no ambiguity. I was the true heir. Preston was not. Preston was a 99.9% biological match to Dominic Blackwood, the golden child, the heir to the Mercer name, the son who got the luxury cars, the massive trust fund, and the country club memberships was a walking, breathing monument to my mother's infidelity. Suddenly, the memory from when I was 7 years old snapped into terrifying focus. I had sat at the breakfast table, swinging my little legs, and asked innocently, "Mom, why do I look exactly like Dad? But Preston doesn't look like either of you." That was the day the house went completely silent. That was the day my suitcases were packed. My mother had not exiled me because I was a difficult child or a disappointment. She exiled me because my face was undeniable proof of the life she was pretending to live. I was the inconvenient witness to her lies. And my father, he had known. A man does not banish his own flesh and blood unless he is desperately trying to protect his fragile ego and his fraudulent marriage. He chose a lie over his own son. I drove straight to Harper Quinn's office and handed the DNA results directly to her. She did not even blink. She just placed the report into a thick black binder, looked up at me with cold, calculating eyes, and smiled. "Julian," she said, "they just handed us the rope. It is time to let them hang themselves. We were ready for war, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming." Before we could bring the heavy hammer down in an actual federal courtroom, the legal process required us to sit through a mandatory mediation session. It is a completely standard procedure in any civil lawsuit, meant to save the court's valuable time and force the warring parties to find a reasonable middle ground before public resources are spent on a trial. But in my specific case, it was the absolute perfect stage to let my family dig their own graves. I did not want a middle ground. I did not want a compromise or a quiet settlement. I wanted a complete, unearthing excavation of the truth. I wanted the rot exposed to the sunlight, and I wanted them to be the ones who pulled the covers off. The mediation took place in a high-end corporate conference room in downtown Boston. It was one of those aggressively modern legal spaces designed specifically to make you feel incredibly small and entirely intimidated before you even sit down. It was located on the 42nd floor of a massive glass skyscraper. It had massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. There was a heavy mahogany table that spanned the entire length of the room, polished so perfectly it looked like dark glass. The chairs were thick, imported leather that cost significantly more than my first car. I walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, flanked by my corporate lawyer, Harper Quinn. Harper was a force of nature. She carried a single, thick black briefcase and wore an expression of absolute, terrifying boredom. I carried absolutely nothing but the cold, hard certainty that I was about to permanently end my family's 30-year reign of emotional terror. My parents arrived exactly 20 minutes late. It was a classic, textbook power play designed specifically to make us wait and establish their social dominance in the room. They wanted me to sit there and sweat, to revert to the anxious child who always waited for their approval. When the heavy, frosted glass doors finally opened, they walked in like they were attending an exclusive country club gala rather than a high-stakes legal mediation regarding severe corporate sabotage and a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit. My mother, Victoria, wore a pristine navy blue silk dress and her signature, heavy string of pearls. Her bright blonde hair was flawlessly styled, not a single strand out of place despite the windy Boston morning outside. She carried a designer handbag that cost more than a semester of college tuition. She looked exactly like the wealthy, untouchable matriarch she had always pretended to be. She walked with her chin tilted up, refusing to even glance in my direction. My father, Richard, wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit. He constantly shot his cuffs so his heavy gold Rolex practically flashed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. He carried a leather portfolio, projecting the image of a busy commercial real estate tycoon who was merely taking a brief pause from his massive empire to swat away a pesky mosquito. Preston trailed right behind them. He was wearing a gray cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. He looked slightly nervous, his eyes darting around the massive room, but he was doing his absolute best to mimic his father's arrogant, wide-shouldered posture. He sat down next to Victoria, acting like the loyal prince protecting the queen. They had also brought my Aunt Clara. Clara had absolutely no legal standing to be there whatsoever. She was not a party to the lawsuit. She held no corporate position, but she was clearly brought along to act as the family's emotional battering ram. She was ready to deploy fake tears, talk about her own messy divorce to gain sympathy, and launch guilt trips on command. Their lawyer was a slick, overpriced, overly tanned litigator who looked like he spent significantly more time on the golf course trying to secure wealthy clients than he ever did in a law library reading actual case files. He wore a patronizing smile and unbuttoned his suit jacket as he sat down, projecting total ease. We all sat down at the massive mahogany table. The tension in the room was so incredibly thick you could have easily cut it with a knife. The mediator, an older, exhausted-looking retired judge with silver hair, laid out the ground rules. He stated that we were there to resolve the dispute regarding the Beatrice Legacy Foundation funding, the subsequent allegations of defamation, the severe damage to my tech company's reputation, and the potential threat to my corporate promotion. My mother's lawyer immediately took the floor. He stood up, buttoned his expensive suit jacket, opened his perfectly organized white binder, and began painting a picture of me that was so entirely divorced from reality. It was almost impressive to witness. He claimed that I was a deeply troubled, highly volatile young man who had always harbored intense, irrational jealousy toward his younger brother. He told the mediator that my sudden influx of massive wealth from the sale of my tech company had triggered an aggressive paranoia and a severe mental breakdown. He painted my mother as a heartbroken, devoted, fiercely loving parent who simply wanted to honor my late grandmother's memory with a beautiful charitable foundation. He used a voice full of fake, theatrical sympathy. He made it sound like they were the helpless victims of a greedy, ungrateful son who was lashing out because of imaginary childhood grievances and a desperate need for attention. Then, he leaned forward, steepled his manicured fingers on the mahogany table, and dropped what he truly thought was the ultimate, inescapable bombshell. He slid a stack of freshly printed papers across the glass table toward Harper and me. It was the emails. The fake, entirely fabricated emails that my mother had completely manufactured to make it look like I was actively extorting the family. "We did not want to bring these into the light," their lawyer said, shaking his head with manufactured sadness and looking directly at the mediator. "But my clients have been subjected to severe emotional distress and outright blackmail by Julian. As you can clearly see in these printed communications, Julian threatened to maliciously destroy his father's commercial real estate ventures and public standing unless a massive portion of the family estate was immediately liquidated and transferred directly to his personal accounts. We have the digital footprint. We are prepared to take this to the press, to the Wall Street Journal, and to your new corporate board if Julian insists on dragging his mother's noble charitable efforts through the mud. You will lose your massive salary and your new promotion before the week is over." I looked down at the printed papers resting on the table. The language in the emails was melodramatic, aggressive, and incredibly clumsy. It sounded exactly like a bad soap opera script written by someone who had never actually engaged in corporate extortion. It was not the way a 32-year-old data scientist writes. I looked across the table at my mother. She was watching my face closely, waiting for a reaction. She expected me to panic. She expected me to sweat, to beg, to back down the way I always did when I was a terrified 7-year-old boy being shipped off to Maine. She expected me to write the massive check just to make the nightmare go away. Instead, I just looked at her and felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, just a cold, clinical observation of a predator who had finally stepped blindly into a steel trap. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Julian, we do not want to ruin your career. We know you are waiting on a major promotion and a permanent board seat at your new parent company. This lawsuit is a terrible, ugly distraction for everyone involved. If you simply sign the funding agreement for the foundation today, commit the initial $300,000, and sign a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding all family matters, we will destroy these emails right now. We can walk out of here today and put this ugliness behind us forever." Aunt Clara leaned across the table, her eyes wide with manufactured concern, her voice trembling perfectly. "Julian, please listen to your parents. Family is everything. You simply cannot put a price on blood. Your grandmother Beatrice would be so incredibly ashamed to see you attacking your own mother this way. Just sign the papers, honey. Do the right thing and come back to the family." They were so incredibly smug. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought their fabricated evidence was a silver bullet that would force me to open my wallet and fund their fraudulent lifestyle forever. Harper Quinn sat perfectly still next to me. She did not even bother opening her black briefcase yet. She let them talk. She let them put their extortion demands on the official mediation record. Every single word they said was being transcribed by the court reporter sitting quietly in the corner of the room. Harper was deliberately allowing them to build their own gallows piece by piece, word by word. After a long, suffocating silence, Harper finally leaned forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not posture or point fingers. She just looked directly at their overpriced lawyer and asked one simple, devastating question. "Counsel, are your clients officially stating on the record that these printed emails are authentic communications received directly from my client, Julian?" Their lawyer nodded confidently, completely unaware of the active minefield he was walking into. "Yes, we have sworn affidavits from Victoria and Richard attesting to their complete authenticity. We maintained a strict chain of custody for the digital files." Harper wrote something down on her yellow legal pad with a silver fountain pen. "And your clients are fully aware that submitting fabricated evidence in a legal proceeding, including a sworn civil mediation, constitutes perjury and carries severe criminal penalties under federal law?" My mother scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes like she was dealing with an annoying retail worker who had messed up her coffee order. "We are not the ones lying here, Ms. Quinn. My son is deeply unwell. We are just trying to protect ourselves from his relentless greed. Stop playing legal games and tell your client to sign the agreement." I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had packed my bags while I was sleeping and shipped me away to a freezing coastal town. I looked at the woman who had refused to attend my college graduation because I was not born from the man she truly loved. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent in my childhood wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why I was so fundamentally unlovable. And then I looked at Preston, who was staring at his phone under the table, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire identity, his entire bloodline, and his entire massive inheritance was about to be burned to the absolute ground. "We completely decline your settlement offer," I said clearly, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. "We decline to fund your fraudulent slush fund. We decline your non-disclosure agreement. We will see you in federal court." My father slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of purple. The Rolex smacked sharply against the wood. "You arrogant fool. We will leak every single one of these emails to the press by tomorrow morning. You will lose your corporate contracts. You will lose your board seat. You will be completely toxic in the tech industry. Print them on a massive billboard on the interstate for all I care," I replied, standing up and calmly buttoning my suit jacket. "But make sure you wear something nice to the evidentiary hearing next week. The lighting in the federal courthouse is terrible, and you will want to look your best for the public record." We walked out of the conference room, leaving them sitting in a stunned, angry silence. They thought they had won. They thought their money, their exclusive zip code, and their perfectly curated social image made them completely untouchable. They were walking straight into the slaughterhouse, and they had absolutely no idea. The pre-trial evidentiary hearing took place on a miserable gray Thursday morning in Boston. The federal courthouse was an intensely intimidating space. It was all dark wood paneling, incredibly high ceilings, and an oppressive heavy silence that seemed to swallow all sound. The architecture itself was designed to make you feel the absolute weight of the law. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Harper Quinn. Behind us, the gallery was mostly empty, save for a few court reporters, some law clerks, and a couple of journalists who had caught wind of a high-profile corporate defamation lawsuit involving a major tech acquisition. Across the wide center aisle, my family sat at the defense table. My mother was wearing another expensive, conservative designer outfit, trying to project the image of a respectable, wronged matriarch. She had toned down her jewelry, clearly advised by her lawyer to look more relatable, but her posture was still rigid with country club arrogance. My father looked unusually tired. The severe stress of his failing real estate deals and the looming threat to his reputation were clearly taking a heavy toll on his posture. Preston sat rigid between them, trying to look composed, but failing every time he nervously glanced at the massive stack of black binders sitting on our table. The federal judge presiding over the case was a no-nonsense woman with a terrifying reputation for zero tolerance when it came to white-collar corporate fraud and perjury. She demanded absolute respect and clarity in her courtroom. The hearing was technically supposed to focus on civil claims regarding the defamation, the foundation's misuse of my name, and the leaked corporate documents. Instead, it became the exact hour their entire family mythology cracked open and bled out in public. Harper stood up and started with the money. Money is the only language people like my parents truly respect, and it is where they always imagine they are the safest. She methodically laid out the Beatrice Legacy Foundation structure. She projected the financial documents onto the large courtroom screens for everyone to see. She showed the inflated vendor relationships, the absurd consulting payments funneled directly to my mother's personal offshore accounts, and the massive six-figure salary allocated to Preston for a charity that had not actually registered a single tax-exempt charitable activity. She showed how Preston's supposed charity work was nothing more than a front to access a fake college fund payout to fund his lavish lifestyle. The judge looked over her reading glasses at the defense table. "Let me understand this," the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. "How many actual scholarships has this foundation awarded to date?" My mother's lawyer stood up, sweating slightly under the harsh courtroom lights. "Your Honor, the foundation is in its preliminary launch phase. We are currently focusing on administrative infrastructure and securing initial donors." "How many beneficiaries have been served?" the judge pressed, her tone hardening. "None at this time, Your Honor." "And yet," Harper interjected, stepping out from behind our table smoothly, "the executive director, Preston, has already drawn $40,000 in advance salary. Furthermore, the defense has utilized this entirely fraudulent entity to solicit a $300,000 donation from my client under deeply false pretenses." The defense attorney tried to object, trying desperately to frame it as simple mismanagement during a rushed corporate launch. He tried to claim they were just setting up the groundwork. But Harper was already moving to the forged communications. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to raise her voice. She simply handed a thick technical dossier to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has submitted sworn affidavits claiming my client sent extortion emails demanding portions of their commercial real estate holdings," Harper said clearly, addressing the entire room. "We have subpoenaed the domain registration paths, the server traces, and the metadata for those specific communications. Our digital forensic experts have conclusively proven that those emails were generated from a cheap burner device purchased at a Walmart in South Boston. That device was activated using a credit card belonging to a PR consultant directly employed by Victoria." Harper paused, letting the heavy silence hang in the air before delivering the fatal blow. "Furthermore, the IP addresses used to send the fabricated extortion demands trace back directly to the secure Wi-Fi network inside the Mercer family residence. The timestamps on the emails correlate exactly with the times Victoria's personal phone was connected to that same network. The entire courtroom went so incredibly still I could actually hear the low hum of the air conditioning unit. My mother's face completely changed. The smug, untouchable mask melted away into sheer, unadulterated panic. It was not shame. Narcissists do not feel shame. It was the terrifying, suffocating realization that she had completely lost control of the narrative. Her jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might actually crack. She looked at her lawyer, demanding him to fix it, but he was staring at the floor. The judge stared down at the forensic report, her expression hardening into absolute stone. "Counsel," she said to my parents' lawyer, "are you prepared to contest this metadata analysis regarding the fabricated evidence your clients submitted to this court under oath?" The lawyer looked at my parents, his face completely pale. He knew he was standing on a collapsing floor. He requested a brief pause, stammering about needing to consult with his clients. But Harper was not finished. The trap was fully sprung, but the kill shot was still waiting in the black binder. "Your Honor," Harper continued, her voice cutting through the rising panic at the defense table, "the defense has consistently painted my client as a bitter, unstable individual to justify their severe smear campaign and their attempts to drain his finances. They have claimed this is a sudden breakdown of a loving family. We ask permission to introduce evidence relevant to a long-standing, multi-decade pattern of severe family deception and manipulation, directly tied to the motive behind the present fraud. The judge nodded slowly. Aloud. Proceed. Harper opened the final black binder. She pulled out the sealed laboratory reports. The defense has built a public image of absolute perfection while actively hiding a massive financial and personal fraud. To understand why Victoria targeted her eldest son with such vicious, unhinged retaliation, one must look at why he was removed from the home at age 7 and systematically denied access to college funds and his rightful inheritance. Harper clicked a button, and the DNA summary was projected cleanly onto the large screens. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can still see exactly how every single person in the room reacted. According to legally admissible, strict chain of custody DNA testing, Harper read, her voice ringing out like a bell, "My client, Julian, is the biological son of Richard. However, Preston is not. Preston is a 99.9% biological match to the late Dominic Blackwood, a former associate of Victoria." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the sound of a 30-year lie instantly vaporizing. My father did not look surprised. He did not gasp. He just lowered his head, staring at the mahogany table, looking utterly defeated. That was somehow the worst part of the entire revelation. He had always known. He had always known the truth. He chose to banish his real son to protect a fake marriage, a fake family image, and avoid a messy public divorce that would have hurt his real estate business. My mother looked like she had been physically struck by a massive freight train. She gripped the edge of the defense table, her knuckles stark white, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. She looked around the room, realizing there was no PR spin in the world that could erase scientific data projected in a federal court. But it was Preston who completely broke. Preston stared at the projected laboratory page for a full 5 seconds. You could practically see his entire reality, his entire identity, fracturing into a million jagged pieces. He turned his head very slowly and looked at the man he had called his father his entire life. "You knew?" Preston asked. His voice was barely a whisper, completely stripped of its usual arrogance and country club confidence. My father did not look up. He just gave the smallest, most pathetic nod I have ever seen another human being give. Preston looked at my mother next. The expression on his face was not just rage. It was a complete psychological collapse. Every Porsche, every Ferrari, every massive college fund, every country club membership had been built on the back of his mother's lies. He was the living, breathing proof of her infidelity, elevated to a golden pedestal simply to hide the dirty truth. My mother finally found her voice. "This is irrelevant," she shrieked, standing up abruptly. Her heavy chair scraped loudly against the courtroom floor. "This is a vicious, disgusting attack on our family. He has no right to bring this into a courtroom. This has nothing to do with the foundation. It has everything to do with motive, Your Honor," Harper fired back seamlessly. "Victoria has spent 30 years covering up her fraud. When my client began asking questions as a child about his lack of resemblance to his brother, he was exiled. When he became wealthy, she attempted to use a fraudulent charity to extract his money to save her husband's failing business. And when he refused, she manufactured federal evidence to destroy his career. The motive is absolute control and the preservation of a 30-year lie." The judge banged her heavy wooden gavel, instantly silencing my mother's hysterical protests. The judge looked directly at my parents, her eyes filled with absolute disgust. Submitting forged materials in a court context where authenticity is legally material is a severe violation of federal law, the judge announced, her voice echoing in the silent room. "I am referring this matter for immediate criminal review. The district attorney will be notified regarding the false reporting, perjury, and the fraudulent submission of evidence by Victoria. This hearing is adjourned." As the judge walked out of the room, Preston stood up. He did not look at our mother. He did not look at our father. He turned his back on them and walked straight out of the courtroom doors without looking back. My mother sank back into her chair, her flawless posture finally broken. There is a specific, incredible moment when narcissistic people realize that their charm, their money, and their manipulation will not work anymore. I watched that exact realization hit my mother in real time as two court officers approached the defense table to speak with her attorney about the criminal referral. She was not dragged away screaming in handcuffs. Reality is much crueler than that. She simply lost altitude all at once. The lifelong confidence that she could rearrange the truth just by performing over it was completely gone. In the months that immediately followed the explosive federal hearing, consequences arrived the way they always do in wealthy, image-obsessed families. It did not happen in one sudden, cinematic explosion. It was a slow, agonizing process that relentlessly bled them dry day by day, stripping away everything they held dear until there was nothing left but the truth they had tried so desperately to outrun. My mother tried to fight the criminal charges at first. She hired expensive crisis PR firms, attempting to spin the narrative, and threatened massive countersuits against the tech industry and my legal team. She tried to claim she was framed, that she was a victim of elder abuse by an ungrateful child. But the digital forensics regarding the fake extortion emails were absolutely impossible to outrun. Once you lie to a federal judge and hand them the exact IP address proving you did it from your own living room, there is no amount of Boston high society charm that can save you. Her lawyers eventually forced her to take a plea deal to avoid a massive, highly publicized trial that would have exposed even more financial rot and the deeply embarrassing details of her affair with Dominic Blackwood. Between the fraudulent foundation activity across state lines, the false reporting to federal authorities, the bribery of my employee Maya, and the use of fabricated materials in the legal process, the federal prosecutors were completely merciless. She was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal facility. I did not go to her sentencing hearing. I did not need to see her in handcuffs or a standard-issue orange jumpsuit to know that she had finally paid the price. The true punishment for a woman like Victoria was not the prison cell itself. It was the absolute, crushing public disgrace. It was the permanent, unerasable legal record confirming that she was exactly what my grandmother Beatrice had always known she was: a fraud. A liar who had destroyed her own family to protect her vanity. My father's downfall was quieter, but no less devastating. The board of directors at his commercial real estate firm did not wait for the scandal to hit the front pages of the local papers. The moment the criminal referral was made public, they called an emergency meeting and forced him into early retirement immediately. The official company press release stated he was stepping away to focus on personal family matters. It is that specific, bloodless corporate language institutions use when absolutely everyone in the boardroom knows a massive scandal is the real cause, but nobody wants to risk the legal liability of using the actual nouns. The social world my parents had spent 30 years meticulously building evaporated faster than I ever thought possible. Invitations to the country club galas completely stopped. Their seats on various museum committees and exclusive charity boards magically disappeared overnight. People who had once endlessly praised my mother's elegance and my father's brilliant business judgment developed a sudden, fierce loyalty to keeping their absolute distance. They were shunned by the HOA. They were ignored at the grocery store. That part did not surprise me at all. Circles built entirely on wealth and superficial image never punish corruption because it is immoral. They punish it because it is deeply embarrassing. Preston disappeared entirely for a while. When I finally heard where he had gone, it was through Harper, who heard it through the complicated legal channels that open up when a family starts dividing itself in public. Preston had left Massachusetts completely. He stopped using the Mercer last name socially. He moved out west and rented a small, nondescript apartment under the name Preston Blackwood. I did not know exactly what I felt when I heard that. Pity, maybe. A little bit of lingering anger, but mostly a strange sense of recognition. He had spent his entire life occupying the place I was wrongfully denied, driving the expensive sports cars, attending the elite private schools, but his entire existence had been built out of the exact same dishonesty that had hollowed out the rest of the family. We were not equal victims. I will never lie and pretend that we were. He enjoyed the extreme luxury and the massive college fund while I scrubbed sticky diner floors. But he was not untouched by what our mother had done. Her lies destroyed him, too. He lost his inheritance, his identity, and the only father he had ever known in a single afternoon. Exactly a year after the trial, my father reached out to me one final time. He called from a new, unlisted number. I answered, and his voice sounded incredibly old, stripped of all the corporate bravado and deep confidence he used to carry in his broad shoulders. He told me that there had always been a trust fund set up in my name, funded decades earlier by my grandfather. It contained roughly $1.2 million. It had been protected, untouched, just sitting there generating compound interest while I was taking out high-interest student loans and struggling to buy cheap groceries in college. He listened to the silence on the line before speaking again, using the pathetic language of late regret. He tried to offer the trust fund as proof that he had loved me in the only cowardly way he knew how. He said he kept it hidden so my mother would not drain it to pay off her country club debts and finance Preston's lifestyle. I did not yell at him. By that point in my life, rage had become far too precious a gift to hand to a man who had abandoned me. I stood on the porch of my new house, looking out at the crashing ocean, and simply told him the absolute truth. Money hidden in a secure account for 30 years while you watched your son starve is not love, Richard, I said, my voice completely steady. It is guilt. It is hush money for your own conscience. Keep the money. Buy yourself a smaller house. You are going to need it to pay off your lawyers. Then I hung up the phone. I never spoke to him again. When the legal dust finally settled and the massive settlement funds from my tech business acquisition completely cleared the bank, I made the very first decision in my life that actually felt entirely clean. I took a significant portion of my wealth and turned my grandmother's name into something no one in my biological family could ever poison. I officially founded the Beatrice Legacy Foundation, but I structured it exactly the way the fraudulent family foundation had only pretended to be structured. I installed a fiercely independent board of directors. I mandated transparent, publicly accessible governance, and strict outside auditing. There were absolutely no family appointments, no vanity salaries for executives, and no emotional manipulation disguised as a charitable mission. We fully funded full-ride scholarships and established a massive college fund for students coming strictly from fractured, abusive families. We specifically targeted the kids who were brilliant but entirely overlooked. The high-achieving kids who were completely unsupported. The kinds of kids who had learned far too early in life that love and reliability are not synonyms. But more importantly, I added a massive mandatory mental health stipend to every single scholarship award. Because education can completely change a kid's future tax bracket and get them out of poverty, but deep psychological healing changes the person who actually has to live inside that future. Building the foundation did not magically erase the traumatic memories of my childhood, but it gave my anger a productive direction that did not rot me from the inside out. I also built something else, though it took significantly longer and required much more courage. I built a chosen family. My therapist, Dr. Felix, became one of the very first safe witnesses to my entire life. He was a man who never once asked me to be more forgiving than I was honest. He helped me untangle the massive knots of guilt that abusive parents specifically wire into their children. He taught me that I did not have to carry the weight of their failures, and that their inability to love me was a reflection of their own brokenness, not my lack of worth. Winston, the CEO of the tech conglomerate that bought my company, became a true mentor. When my mother's PR smear campaign tried to ruin my promotion and my career, Winston publicly vouched for my character and my brilliance, refusing to let the toxic gossip affect our multimillion-dollar deal. He showed me what actual professional loyalty looked like. A few close friends became people I could call without first having to edit my personality into something easier for them to carry. That was the strangest, most beautiful part of the healing process. Healing was not the total absence of pain. It was the total absence of performance. I finally realized that I no longer had to be exceptionally brilliant just to earn a seat at the table. I no longer had to succeed loudly enough to be noticed. I no longer had to lay awake at night wondering whether being loved would be instantly revoked the second I became inconvenient. Today, I live in coastal Maine. I bought the house where my grandmother Beatrice raised me. I completely renovated it, fixing the drafty windows and upgrading the kitchen, but keeping the heavy cedar chest exactly where I found it in the attic. Some nights, I sit in her kitchen with a cup of black coffee, listening to the rain hit the windows, and I think about the little 7-year-old boy I used to be. The boy who swung his legs at the breakfast table, trying to understand why a simple, innocent question about his own face had changed his entire life. I wish I could go back in time and tell him everything earlier. I wish I could kneel down, look him in those dark eyes, and tell him that the adults around him were not powerful because they were right. They were powerful simply because he was small, and they were cruel enough to use his size against him. I wish I could tell him that one day, he would completely stop confusing their profound rejection with his own value. That may be the single most important thing I learned through all of this legal warfare and heartbreak. Family is not automatically the people who share your blood and then systematically weaponize your silence. Family is the people who show up for you without asking whether you have become successful enough to deserve their tenderness. Your worth as a human being is not created by parental approval. It never ever was. Parents can fail their children completely, catastrophically, and still legally remain parents on paper. That does not make them right. It does not make the child hard to love. It simply makes the parents limited, damaged, intensely selfish, frightened, or morally weak. Walking away from the people who failed you repeatedly is not a selfish act. It is very often the first honest act of self-respect in a life built entirely around surviving their absolute dishonesty. And if you can do one better, if you can take the exact thing they tried to break inside of you and turn it into a shelter for someone else, then that is not just revenge. That is pure transformation. That is exactly how you make sure the generational pain stops with you instead of becoming a toxic inheritance for the next generation. I never got the graduation day I truly deserved. I never got parents who looked at me with uncomplicated, pure pride. I never got a childhood completely untouched by constant comparison, dark secrecy, and emotional exile. But I did get this. I got the absolute truth. I got my name back entirely on my own terms. I got a life that no longer bends around waiting to be chosen by people who had already made their terrible decision. The most satisfying ending was not watching their empire collapse. It was my fierce, undeniable refusal to collapse with them. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I know it was a heavy journey, but if you take anything away from this, let it be this: you are allowed to walk away from toxic bloodlines. You are allowed to set boundaries that protect your peace. Your value is not determined by those who are too blind to see it. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to cut ties to save yourself? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong and keep building your own life.